Hello, everyone. My name is Pradeep Nayak. I'm at the University of Waterloo, and I'm also representing the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership for building small-scale fisheries, strong in the globe. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, because we know people are joining us from all over the world. So I'm going to be moderating and hosting this webinar today. Just to start with, I'm going to make a few rounds of introductions. So I will introduce the B2B Global Partnership first, and then I will also say a few things about the webinar today. And then I would have the opportunity to introduce our speakers, and we will move on to listening to the webinar talk. Just to start with introducing the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, which is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand and work on vulnerability and viability is not just in an economic sense, but also to capture all aspects of fishers' lives. That encompasses the political, the cultural, the environmental, and all other aspects that influences their living. But at the same time, we also look at the B2B transitions not as only unidirectional, just like vulnerable communities have an opportunity to become viable, very viable communities can also become vulnerable. So we look at it as a two-way process. Our focus is fivefold. We work on co-creation and co-production of knowledge that is essential for engaging in the vulnerability to viability transition work. We work on repositories that can hold this knowledge to be shared amongst all stakeholders. We develop multifaceted capacities right from the community level to the policy and the academia and all other stakeholders, and also engage in synthesis and integration of that knowledge so that it can be used for policy and governance in small-scale fisheries. Of course, one of our major work areas is knowledge mobilization and dissemination of the knowledge that is co-produced. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key civil society, NGO, government, and university partners to enhance small-scale fisheries viability. We're conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged, and policy-driven research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and also 6 countries in Africa, which includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the B2B Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series, for which we have gathered virtually here today, is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academic, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. And you will get a glimpse of that when our speakers speak today. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month and will continue to be so during the 2025 year. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar, including speakers, topics, and titles, and links to webinar platforms are available on our webpage, which is www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the second in the series of B2B thematic webinars planned for the year 2025 and the 50th since January 2021 when it all started. And it is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Fikret Berkes and Nicole Franz as our distinguished speakers today. I will do a brief round of introductions of both our speakers. Dr. Fikret Berkes is a Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba's Natural Resource Institute. Dr. Berkes has devoted most of his professional life to investigating the relations between society and their resources and to examining the conditions under which the tragedy of the commons may be avoided. He works on the theoretical and practical aspects of commons, community-based management, traditional ecological knowledge, and social-ecological resilience. An applied ecologist by training, Dr. Berkes is intellectually admired for his groundbreaking contributions to the human and or the people sciences and interdisciplinary social sciences. His decades of tireless scholarly work has taught all of us the importance of skillfully dismantling and the artificial boundaries between theories, concepts, knowledge systems, and geographies, if the goal is to achieve sustainability. And for that matter, resilience, well-being, empowerment, justice, and above all, social ecological viability. In doing so, he combines social and ecological perspectives for the study of relations between societies and their resources. He is particularly interested in community-based small-scale fisheries and fishing communities and has worked in numerous countries in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and beyond. He has authored or co-authored over 300 peer-reviewed journal papers and chapters, including over 15 books. And one of the books, him and Nicole are going to talk about today. An influential scholar, over 115,000 Google Scholar citations, and a finest human being, Fikret has positively influenced the lives of many and continues to do so tirelessly. And many of us on this call today are on that list. Nicole Franz is a development economist with 20 years of experience in intergovernmental organizations. Nicole is currently affiliated with the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford University, obviously, as a research scholar, while on a one-year leave of absence from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Nicole specializes in the political economy of sustainable development and has worked extensively within the United Nations system, significantly contributing to this topic relating to global policymaking, implementation, and intellectually through her numerous publications. Until recently, Nicole led the Equitable Livelihoods Team in FAO's Fisheries and Aquaculture division. Nicole's role and contributions to the making of the small-scale fisheries guidelines and its implementation is globally recognized. As part of the role in FAO, Nicole coordinated the implementation of the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication, with a focus on inclusive policy processes and stakeholder empowerment. And we'll see a lot of glimpses of that experience and expertise in the talk today. And I'm very proud to also mention that both Fikret and Nicole are core members of the B2B Global Partnership, has made numerous contributions to how the partnership has emerged and has continued. It is my honor today, therefore, to invite Dr. Fikret Berkes and Nicole Franz to deliver today's talk for the V2B Thematic Webinar Series 2025 February, and their talk is titled Governing for Transformation Towards Sustainable Small-Scale Fisheries. It's a great privilege, Nicole and Fikret, to invite you to our webinar today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very kind words and introductions, Pradeep. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks also for giving us a space with the V2V to introduce our new book on governing for transformation towards sustainable small-scale fisheries. It's really a pleasure to be here. You can see on the slide here, you can see the little QR code in the left corner where you can scan with your phone, you can access the online book. For information, Fikret and I today will share the presentation, so we will hand the microphone, so to say, back and forth between us throughout the presentation, and then we look forward to receiving your comments and your questions at the end. So let me start. The starting point for this book was really Fikret's previous book that was called Coasts for People. on interdisciplinary approaches to coastal and marine resource management. This book was published in 2015, the same year as the Voluntary Guidelines for Securing Sustainable Small-Scale Fisheries for Food Security and Poverty Eradication. And these guidelines address the same issues that are also addressed in the Coast for People book, but from a small-scale fisheries lens. And as a lot has happened over the last 10 years, since 2015, with Fikret, we agreed to prepare basically a 10-year update, but this time with a focus on small-scale fisheries. And today we will provide a glimpse of the 10 chapters of this book. The original chapters of Fikret's book on Coast for People served as a first draft, basically, for the new chapters that have been prepared for this book. And we really had the privilege to work with an extensive group of esteemed colleagues. You can see the names here. And each of these colleagues has specific knowledge and experience in areas that are relevant for small-scale fisheries governance. And these colleagues were, about half of them were from the FAO and the other half from academia and research. So it's really a combination of different also types of authors that we have here. We also aim to have a gender balance in the contributors and also making sure that we have experiences from around the world also in the co-authorship. And we have colleagues here from Africa, from Europe, from Asia, from the Americas. So it's hopefully a really good group that you can see here, that hopefully you recognize some of the very knowledgeable names of colleagues here, including obviously Professor Prateep from the V2V network, as well as also Derek Armitage. So again, also for some of the other co-authors that might be present in the audience, this is an opportunity to thank everybody for the important contributions to this book. The objective for the book was to really prepare an open access book. As Prateep mentioned in the beginning, it's very important, not the dissemination of the knowledge. So it was very important for us to make sure that this book is widely accessible online. And it's a book that hopefully can serve as an authoritative advanced introduction to relevant interdisciplinary and social science concepts, such as resilience, commons, and livelihoods. And it is supposed to supplement scientific literature that is already available, including also some of the FAO materials. The target audience is quite broad, and it includes fisheries and coastal management practitioners, policy and decision makers, but also scholars in the Global South, NGOs and civil society organizations, professors and graduate students seeking a source for interdisciplinary and social science perspectives in fisheries and coastal management. And the book came out just 1 week ago. It went online, and we were just checking the numbers, and we see that already over 1,000 people have looked at it, and over, close to 600 people have downloaded the book. And from the 10 more countries that we can track, 5 countries are in the Global South. So hopefully we are in the process of reaching that target audience through our work. Now, let me briefly start introducing you to the first chapter, which is the introductory chapter that puts small-scale fisheries in context. And this chapter really provides a big picture for global fisheries trends and the reason why small-scale fisheries are important. And for that, it recalls the origins of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And it also shares some of the key findings from the Illuminating Hidden Harvest study, which investigated the contributions of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development. And I will share some of those findings in the next slide with you. And the chapter also introduces FAO's Blue Transformation Roadmap, which aims, among other things, to support the effective management of all fisheries to deliver healthy stocks and secure equitable livelihoods. this chapter summarizes key policy and governance changes that are impacting small-scale fisheries, in particular over the last decade. We see the expansion of rights-based approaches to fisheries management, but at the same time, we also see shifts towards more systems approaches, to more participation and more holistic approaches to fisheries governance and management. So by highlighting in this chapter the multiple contributions of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development, it really establishes the foundation for this book that provides interdisciplinary approaches to fisheries governance. And overall, the result of our collaboration in this volume is that we have a volume that traces the background of key ideas, that includes essential references and evaluates trends and issues, and shares conceptual shifts that are relevant for governing for transformation towards sustainable small-scale fisheries. So as I mentioned, the chapter 1 recalls some of the key findings of this FAO Duke University and World Fish Study that is called Illuminating Hidden Harvest, or IHH. The QR code will take you to that study here on the slide. And as I mentioned, the study estimated the contributions of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development, not only in terms of the production volume and value, but it really looked also at the potential contributions to nutrition, into governance arrangements, at the livelihoods dimensions, and at the role of women. And you can see some of the important numbers that came out at the bottom of the slide here. Importantly, the IHH study also laid the foundation for a Nature paper that was published just a few weeks ago in January on the multidimensional contributions of small-scale fisheries. And this paper, in the words of one of our co-authors for that paper, provides a wonderful synthesis that moves beyond the scattered case studies and fragments of data and provides a big picture in a coherent and urgent way. So I invite you to also look at that very important paper, which even made it on the cover of that edition of Nature. The chapter also recalls the overall trends in terms of aquatic production and status of the resources. And on the left here, you can see how marine capture fisheries in the light blue color and inland capture fisheries in the darker blue color really plateaued around 90 million tons production since the 19th. At the same time, we can see that marine aquaculture, which is in the darker red, in the lighter red, and inland aquaculture in the darker red have really taken off since then, and are providing by now more than half of the global aquatic animal supply. On the right hand, you can see the trends of marine fish stocks that are monitored through the FAO. And in 2021, you can see that the percentage of the stocks considered exploited at maximum sustainable yield was about 50% of the assessed stocks. And if we add what you can see at the bottom, the about 12% of stocks classified as underfished, we see that about 62% of the stocks are considered exploited at biologically sustainable levels. On the other hand, the share of overfished stocks is 38%. And importantly, you can see here that this orange colored part is really increasing in the trend. So this context of changing production and resource availability patterns is part of the dynamic context in which small-scale fisheries governance and management take place. And with this, I hand over to Fikret.
Thanks, Nicole. I'll proceed with what we're doing here, which is a chapter-by-chapter summary of what's in it. And then we have some conclusion slides at the end. The second chapter deals with evolving concepts of resources and management. It was co-authored by Kevin Cochran from South Africa and two FAO colleagues. It traces the shift from top-down biology and economics-focused fisheries management to basically ecosystem-based approaches. FAO publications often refer to EAF, ecosystem approach to fisheries, and to participatory governance. So these are two major trends in fisheries. The chapter discusses balancing these three pillars of sustainable development: ecological, economic, and social, and gets into the ideas of adaptive governance. It also discusses a number of other important trends, and one of these is the idea of ecosystem services. Next, please. Taken from the book, it's an example. The table is an example of ecosystem services. It's from this chapter. It's based on a lake in Malawi, and it's showing not just the fishery, in which something like 99% of households in the area depend, but also 4 other ecosystem services provided by the lake and the surrounding area. And the chapter, rather, the table in the book lists 10 additional items. So basically, we have gone from looking at just the fishery as an output to looking at multiple ecological outputs, ecosystem services from what we're doing. And this has been part of the trends. Next, please. The basic framework for adaptive management, which I often talk about learning by doing, is that you start with a plan, and then you implement that plan, and then you look at your findings, the results, and then you learn from this assessment. And from that experience, you can adapt as needed and go back to implementation, or you can go back to the original plan and revise it and do the cycle all over again. This, as we'll argue, is very important for a rapidly changing world, so we can keep adapting to these changes and do the right thing. Next, please. Chapter 3 deals with social-ecological systems, which we define as integrated, complex, adaptive systems. So it's a complexity concept. These systems are coupled, social systems and ecological systems. They're coupled, they're interdependent, and they're co-evolutionary. So why do we use SES rather than just ecosystems? Well, what the chapter demonstrates is that the SES analysis helps understand globalization and drivers of change that impact small-scale fisheries and many other productive systems, of course. And the key thing here is that these drivers are often unpredictable as part of basically complex systems phenomena. But of course, in recent years, it has become even more pronounced. The chapter explores the use of the SES framework in making a difference in analyzing fisheries and the human systems involved. We illustrate in the next slide, please. This is from a paper by Rosemary Omer, my senior colleague in Canada, and multiple co-authors. What they do is they contrast what they call the current management model, you might say the old management model, in which we deal basically with 2 partners: fishers, which are assumed to be individual and rational people, and the individual fish stocks they deal with, they interact with. Under an SES management model, you still have the individual fishers and the fish stocks together as assemblages, and they are still interacting. But in fact, now the picture has become more complicated because the individual fishers interact with governance issues, they interact with markets, they interact with values, culture, technology, knowledge. And the fish assemblages in turn interact with their environment, the biophysical environment, including other species and including, of course, changes like climate change. Next, please. Chapter 4 deals with fisheries knowledge. Now, as the ecosystem-based management indicates, we're dealing with governance with a human-centered perspective, and that requires knowledge and accounting of a wide range of considerations, values and knowledge, of course, including fisheries knowledge. Knowledge is important because it's an important step towards collaborative governance. If the manager does not recognize fisheries knowledge, what they know, what they think, then you can't do collaborative management. So the chapter talks about how to combine fisheries knowledge with scientific approaches. We're not talking about replacing science with fisheries knowledge, but we're talking about enriching this knowledge. And as Prateep mentioned quickly, we're talking about knowledge co-production and its role in governance. Next, please. Table 10.1 in the chapter talks about some principles of knowledge co-production. And this borrows from a paper mostly by Swedish colleagues, Nordström. And it suggests that a good way to do knowledge co-production, maybe not the only way, but a way that does work. We have, after all, something like 10 years of experience in knowledge co-production. Needs 4 features. It has to be context-based. The issue has to be situated in a particular place and time, but also when you say context-based, we're talking historic context and cultural context. It has to be pluralistic. It can't be based just on different kinds of science. It has to involve different ways of understanding the world, different kinds of knowledge, in particular, of course, fisheries knowledge. Third, it has to be goal-oriented. It has to have a clearly articulated, clearly defined goals related to what we're trying to achieve with knowledge co-production. And finally, it has to be interactive. It has to allow for learning among actors. It has to involve the active joint engagement of actors and learning from one another. In other words, social learning. Next, please. The broader picture here, borrowed in figure 4.2 from the book. Another mostly Swedish team, Maria Tenge, Eduardo Brondizio from IPBES and others. They talk about each of these strands are kinds of knowledge. On the left, mostly scientific knowledge, economics, social sciences, transdisciplinary knowledge. On the right, different kinds of local knowledge, indigenous knowledge. And then you get an enriched picture which helps you integrate knowledge, not integrate in the sense of joining them up, mushing them together, but integrate in the sense of taking into account multiple kinds of knowledge. And it allows for cross-fertilization of knowledge, this idea of learning from one another and co-production of knowledge, as we just saw. Next, please. Chapter 5 is about commons. Commons are shared resources, and as almost everybody knows, we are dealing in in oceans and in aquatic resources, freshwater resources, capture fisheries, we're dealing with commons, defined by Ellen Rostrom as resources in which the control of access of potential users is difficult, and where each user is capable of taking away, subtracting from the welfare of all other users. Ellen Rostrom talks about the importance of collective action rules, and this applies to any small-scale fishery community. And basically what collective action rules, if they can make and enforce these rules, it solves the subtractability problem. In other words, making sure that the use of one user or kind of use does not impact the others. It does not solve the access problem unless the small-scale fishery can control the access of other uses and users. And we'll come back to this at the end. And this is, I think, one of the big issues for small-scale fishery management. The chapter spent some time talking about privatization of aquatic resources as opposed to community-based management. Can commons be used as commons? Or do we have to listen to some kinds of economists and establish property rights of all the commons? Well, we think most commons should be used as commons. We'll come back to that again. Now, institutions which are, as Ostrom describes them, they're rules in use. Their institutions are not buildings, they're not government organizations, but basically rules that are in use. So institutions can be formal and informal. And these are important to move towards equitable and sustainable management. Next, please. These rules can be very informal. Robert Johannes published a book way back in 1981. He went to Palau in the Pacific's smallish island state, and he was studying initially coral reef fisheries. He's a biologist, coral reef biologist, but he also looked at marine tenure and what worked. And what he found was that reef and lagoon resources were under marine tenure, and they were regulated by what he called, or what they called, words of the lagoon. These were, it's also the title of the book, by the way, and it's available online if you want to look it up. It's a classic. Words of the lagoon were the rules in use, devised by the community and enforced by the community by social means. You don't need government regulation to enforce institutions and their rules. Ostrom, well known, in her work with collective action and institutions, Eleanor Ostrom's 1990 book, Governing the Commons, is the main reason she got the Nobel Prize for Economics, even though she's a political scientist. We're talking about transdisciplinary research here. So Ostrom is an economist, of course, as well as a political scientist. And she was a growing ecologist as things were moving. Ostrom formulated design principles for collective action. These are too small here to read out to you. Ostrom's original 8 were later split into a few others. So there are a total of 11 of these design principles, and they deal with subtractability, and they deal with exclusion rules, as well as the ability to govern themselves and the ability to deal with other users and to deal with conflicts internally. So I think I turn it back to Nicole.
Thank you. Pradeep, yeah, I will continue talking a little bit about chapter number 6, which was led by Javier Basurto, and Fikret and myself contributed to it. And this chapter is on co-management and the sharing of power and responsibility. And this chapter really focuses on the collaborative governance, where fishers share management responsibilities with governments or authorities. And this sharing of the rights and the responsibilities over the resources is really strongly supported also by the small-scale fisheries guidelines in a number of provisions. And it is actually a practice that was first documented in fisheries for the Lofoten Island cod fishery in Norway already back in the 1890s. And in the next slide, I will share a bit more about the different types of tenure rights that are the focus of collaborative governance. And this chapter also explores some of the key factors that are critical for co-management success. And these include, for example, trust building, leadership, rule compliance and enforcement, but also the capacity development around that is needed to be able to actually realize co-management and adaptive learning. So it's not a linear process, but it's something that is alive and that evolves over time in a context that is changing. The chapter also looks at the importance of others that play a role in the co-management processes and looks at the importance of a neutral forum and the role of bridging organizations. And those bridging functions can, for example, be taken on by non-government organizations that work with communities and that can have a facilitating role in collaborating in the collaboration between the different co-management partners. And finally, this chapter also observes the evolution of co-management into really adaptive co-management that provides a capability to respond to management challenges in the long term. And here is a figure. It is borrowed from the Illuminating Hidden Harvest report. And this really illustrates how different bundles of devolved rights results in an increased empowerment of the resource user. If we understand access, in this case, as a right to enter fishery and withdrawal, as a right to obtain the products from fishing, at the first level, if you look at the gray boxes here, the access and withdrawal rights, and then the lighter colored reddish box, we can say in that case, the fishers can be considered as authorized users. But then if we add other types of tenure rights, for example, the management right, the right to really decide, for example, what type of gear to use or what moment to fish, the users in that moment, they gain more empowerment through that additional right, and they turn into a claimant with the right to regulate the use and improve the resource base. Now, if we also add exclusion rights to that, and Fikret already mentioned the importance of that, of that right to determine who will have an access and right and how that right might be transferred, then this really increases the power of the resource users. And in this case, we can speak of a fisher as a proprietor. And lastly, by adding also the capacity to transfer or these rights, this means that the right can be sold or can be leased. Then we can speak of resource ownership. So if this full bundle of rights is given to fishers, that is when they really have the highest level of empowerment in terms of governance over the resource. So the actual degree of the devolution of rights can really help to determine whether power is truly given to local communities, or if governments in a way are only shifting part of their own responsibility to manage this common property without, on the other hand, delegating the true authority to do that. Here is another example that is taken from that chapter that is illustrating Chile's management and exploitation areas for marine benthic resources. Those were established in 1991, and these areas basically assign exclusive rights to small-scale fish organizations in specific areas. In Spanish, they're called caletas, to harvest benthic species. And in this case, in particular, this study referred to the economically important Chilean abalone loco. And the design initially for these areas foresaw a so-called, what they call a triumvirate of 3 partners, of fisher associations, state institutions, and technical assistance institutions. But some work that was done, you can see by Fikret with a colleague, Marine, with the social network analysis, found out that actually the fish organizations interacted with no less than 7 functional groups that are illustrated here. The fish associations, but then agencies for power sharing and enforcement, funding agencies, territorial authorities, monitoring, research and development, marketing, and others that include, for example, the private sector and civil society. So this is a visual illustration of the hidden complexities of co-management. I also would like to briefly talk about Chapter 7 on sustainable livelihoods. That was led by Tony Charles, but also had contributions from a colleague from South Africa, Mel Soman, in addition to Fikret's and mine. And this chapter notes that small-scale fisheries are really crucial in the context of the objectives of the Sustainable Development number 1 on poverty eradication and Sustainable Development goal number 2, that relates to food security, in particular in the Global South. And this chapter proposes an analytical framework of sustainable livelihood enablers. One from a governance perspective that looks at the trends over time in the balance of top-down and grassroots decision-making, and that is relevant to the goal of sustainable livelihoods. The second perspective is a socioeconomic development-oriented perspective, to reduce vulnerabilities that also depend on improving access to resources, to markets, credit, social services, and technology and knowledge. And then there's an environmental and natural resource management perspective that considers strategies of sustainable use and stewardship approaches as a means to secure livelihoods. And the chapter also points out the proliferation of multiple uses of aquatic space that is really a threat to small-scale fisheries. But it could also, in some cases, be turned into opportunities, for example, in the context of tourism and fisheries. And here is a quick, deeper look into some of the motivations for environmental stewardship that's drawn from a collection and review of environmental stewardship cases around the world. And what emerged was these motivations include, for example, the local and indigenous communities that are strongly attached to their natural resources and use practices with which they have been engaged in for generations. Another motivation that came out is a strong attachment to place, the land, the sea, the natural resources, and the attributes. And through that, there is this strong sense of attachment to these attributes and the sense of place. Another motivation relates to the socioeconomic needs that are often linked to maintaining healthy ecosystems, which are really the basis of the livelihood system. And lastly, the ethical responsibility to take care of the earth, and that prevents environmental degradation and use and supports the use of resources sustainably. So this shows really the intrinsic linkages between sustainable livelihoods and healthy environments. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Pradeep, to Fikret.
Thanks, Nicole. We have a chapter on resilience. Of course, that's a big topic. So we narrowed it down by focusing on climate change in particular in terms of what to do with resilience. Resilience has many definitions. The definition that we've been using is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change, but retaining essential system characteristics. So it's a systems concept. It goes with what I talked about in chapter 3, social-ecological systems. It recognizes that systems are always changing, but we look at some of these essential variables, essential system characteristics for resilience. In practical terms, resilience is the ability of the system to persist and adapt. And the idea with the adaptation is that it leaves it better prepared for future and new disturbances, in this case related to climate change. This V2V group, of course, is very interested in vulnerability. So we spent some time in this chapter to talk about vulnerability reduction and resilience building as complementary components of small-scale fisheries sustainability. We talk a lot about adaptive governance in this chapter because it's the key policy approach. This is really the policy lesson of resilience. That is, you need governance which brings a long-term focus, and that's done by iterative learning by doing. Next, please. Now, this is, not everybody agrees with this analysis, but we're following here Chris Bennett and Kate Brown in characterizing resilience as encompassing 3 kinds of capacities: absorptive capacity, meaning coping, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. Coping, first of all, how it works is that the shock intensity of change, the intensity of shock is very important in determining what kind of response is possible. At low levels of shock, stability is possible, and that's basically the coping response, the system buffering and absorbing a small disturbance, maintaining stability. At an intermediate level of shock intensity, a moderate level of shock intensity, what you need is flexibility. That's the adaptive component, the adaptive capacity. Again, by learning-based adaptation and adjusting responses to changes. At severe levels of shock intensity, well, the change is very radical. It transforms the whole system. We had one case where we were looking for a small-scale fishery in Gulf of Maine in the US, and if lobster disease comes into the bay, and it might with climate change and warming seawaters, their fishery is no longer sustainable or possible even. And the fishers are already preparing for the possibility that they might just go into recreation instead of fishing. So we're looking at 3 kinds of capacities. Next, please. Well, so how do you combine the 2 together, reducing vulnerability and building resilience? That's a major policy goal of FAO. And of course, that's also a major goal of the V2V partnership. The point we make is that resilience building can go hand in hand with vulnerability reduction. We give the example of the Amazon River in Brazil near Manaus, which is Upper Amazon. And these are Ribeirinhos people, mixed heritage Ribeirinhos people. They have to deal with rising water levels in the Amazon and extreme floods. The problem is these extreme floods are unpredictable. So what do? They seem to be combining, and this is taking from the PhD thesis work of Tiago Almudi, who actually lives there now, and my colleague at the University of Manitoba, John Sinclair. What Tiago found is that the Ribeirinhos had coping responses, and give you an example, they were finding that their homes were being flooded unpredictably at different times of the year. So they were building a second floor to their houses. So if the first floor becomes unlivable, they just go up to the second floor. But at the same time, they were working on long-term adaptive responses. They were looking for species suitable for this new normal. Some crops just don't do well. This is an agricultural community for the Ribeirinhos. Some crops are just wiped out if you have the high flood, but other crops seem to survive quite well. So they are developing new species. They're looking for new species they can use, but of course they have also to develop ways of transporting them, ways of marketing them, ways of transporting them to the markets. So there's a whole range of what you might call development type responses. So the example demonstrates the role of community development to decrease overall vulnerability, followed by responses more narrowly devised for resilience. And it's basically developing more options and trying out new alternatives. Next, please. Chapter 9 is adding to the ecosystem approach to fisheries, which FAO does very well. But now we need to add to it the human rights-based approach. And here we're borrowing it's still involving Nicole and myself, but we're adding the work of Eddie Allison at World Fish, borrowing heavily from him, but also from Milena Arias-Schreiber, who's a Peruvian and teaches at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. So the FAO's EAF does respond to the need to embrace an interdisciplinary view. But if we're going to balance this multiple objectives, social as well as biological and economic, it really requires improved attention to the social dimension. As many of you have seen, social dimension is often the weak dimension, the missing dimension, but to us, the most important dimension, of course. And the way to do it is to go to human rights-based approaches, because human rights are universal rights. They're applicable to all areas, not just fisheries. And the human rights-based approach helps protect small-scale fisheries by countering the economic rights-based approach. Combining the two is really significant because human rights integrate social justice into governance by empowering small-scale fisheries through inclusion and by building their capabilities through development. Next, please. So we're running short on time. So very quickly, the ecosystem approach to fisheries is integrative, risk-averse, adaptive, deals with unpredictability, advocates participation. Now we're adding social justice. So what happens is combining the two helps break away from many of the assumptions and practices of old management, conventional management, because it expands the scope of management to governance, which by definition has to be cooperative, multi-level, partnerships, knowledge co-production, and leads to adaptive governance. If you look back to the old kind of management, it was the solution seen by the mid-20th century fathers of fisheries management. But what we got now is a kind of governance unforeseen by these fathers of fisheries management. Next, we go back to, not Pradeep, we go back to
for now, we go back to me. So I'm going to briefly walk you through the last chapter, which basically is a synthesis and provides some conclusions. So the synthesis is also commenting on some of the chapters. I'm not going to be able to do justice to it, but something that's important in this last chapter that it tries to recall some of the major conceptual shifts in fisheries management, and that includes that if we look deep into these changes, then we can identify two concepts in human and environment interactions, or two trends or conceptual shifts that really stand out. And those include the adoption of a holistic systems view instead of reductionism, for example, and the heavy reliance on stock-by-stock assessments. And secondly, the increasing use of participatory governance, co-management. And what we also see is that these trends have been accompanied by learning-based approaches. Now we spoke a lot about the adaptive governance, adaptive co-management, and the importance to be able to make changes, not to adjust to conditions that are changing continuously and probably accelerating in speed, as we see. We also see that there's an evolution of some of the key concepts. The way we consider management has evolved a lot over the last decades, and the term itself, the concepts, how we understand those have evolved. When we talk about resources, when we talk about poverty, poverty is no longer looked at only in economic terms, no, but it also goes much beyond that, and really relates more, for example, to capability approach that was introduced by Amartya Sen. We also see, importantly, the appearance of the new concepts, and Fikret just spoke about it in relation, for example, to the human rights-based approach and its application to small-scale fisheries, or fisheries more broadly, and concepts related to that are emerging is, for example, the concept also of blue justice. That was, in a way, it's a term that has been developed by the Too Big to Ignore research network on small-scale fisheries also. So through the chapter, the book calls for this adaptive governance in the context of important changes. And just to recall some of these changes, the current context, those include, for example, the myriad of environmental problems that we are facing through climate change, through biodiversity loss at the level of the ecosystem, at the level of the species, and also in terms of the genetic diversity, but also issues like pollution that are impacting the environment, the land, the inland waters, but also the oceans, obviously. Secondly, we see the fast-spreading privatization of aquatic resources, including through the use of individual transferable quotas, not only in large-scale fisheries, but also in some small-scale fisheries. And combined with an increasing concentration of power in the ocean economy, this really means that we see that the aquatic commons are rapidly shrinking, and fisheries are often marginalized through that process. And you can see in this figure here on the right-hand side, which is actually not in the book, but it really illustrates all of these developments in a kind of funny way, but only superficially funny, because it's quite a serious issue, as you can see, how the different other ocean users, water users, are really having a massive impact. And the truth is that small-scale fishing communities have to face unprecedented environmental and economic challenges, which often further accentuate their marginalization. So this reminds us that according to commons theory, the ability to exclude others is crucial, because without this ability, collective action cannot be taken. And that's a point that Fikret already pointed out earlier on in this presentation that we really want to bring back and re-emphasize. It is not new, but it is, again, it's a point that really needs to be considered in decision-making, in how management and governance is structured. it is important that small-scale fisheries were historically community managed. And these communities define the rules and the rights to ensure, to use the ecosystem. And this is really grounded in the fact that healthy communities depend on healthy stocks. So they take care of them. And healthy stocks, on the other hand, then depend on healthy communities that have the incentive to make sure that their livelihood base is protected. This means that leveraging this social ecological connection and enabling community-based conservation needs stewardship incentives and collective action. And this requires rights-based approaches and attending to small-scale fisheries development needs, including those related to services outside of the fisheries sectors. For example, ensuring access to education or to financial services. So ensuring this collaboration, this transdisciplinary approach also, for example, in policy is fundamental. And it also, this chapter, or maybe most importantly, it recalls a need for the capacity to learn from experience, to adapt to ever-changing and evolving environments and contexts. And that relates back to the resilience that Fikret was also speaking about. And for that, we're going to stop our presentation here, and we look forward to receive your comments and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both Nicole and Fikret. That's a wonderful, outline of the excellent work that has been put together, of course, under your leadership, but also from contributions from numerous, collaborators there. We will have, about 30 minutes, and lucky enough, this is a special webinar, so we have 15 minutes more. Usually we have 1 hour and 15 minutes, but today it is scheduled for 1 hour and 30 minutes. So we have about 25 to 30 minutes for questions. So we are requesting our YouTube audience to please write your comments and questions in the chat, so we'll read it out to our speakers. But I would just start by asking a broader question about the title of the book. So governing the transformation, and then when you were outlining each of the chapters, it's so fascinating to see how there are multiple contradictions and synergies and complementarities across these chapters. So one chapter provides certain challenges like power and co-management, sharing. The others bring in certain ways of responding to those. So it kind of looks like governing the transformation in many ways means governing the contradictions and also the synergies that are emerging in the space for small-scale fisheries. So how do you capture that? So what are we governing actually? Are we governing the transformation, or are we, governing the process towards transformation, which is, of course, ridden with all of these numerous things that each of these chapters, talk about.
Fikret, you want to go first?
No, you go first. Your title is mostly yours, so.
Yeah, I mean, we may need to explain a little bit the history of the title. We spoke about it. It had different iterations, and it somehow relates also to the fact that there's a lot of talk about transformation at the moment. From the FAO perspective, for example, the work of the Fisheries and Aquaculture division at the moment is really grounded in what is called this blue transformation. There's the blue economy, there's a blue growth. Now there's a blue transformation that is guiding the work of the FAO's Fisheries and Aquaculture division. And one of the pillars in that relates to capture fisheries has different objectives, and those relate, for example, to the management of fisheries in a way that embraces not only the environmental sustainability, but also the livelihood dimension. So again, it's not necessarily new, no? The ecosystem approach to fisheries that FAO has been promoting for many years and working countries with to apply it is doing the same. But we also see that
even though we are aware of it, there is still a lot of knowledge that is lacking, and there's still a disconnected times between the different levels that are needed for transformation. And in the book, we talk about what needs to be transformed in many ways, and that starts from the understanding of certain concepts, no? And the book provides the opportunity to show how a transformation already took place in a way, in terms of how we look at the concept of management, how we look at the concept of resources, how we understand their connections, and how that is transforming. So it's the intention here is in a way to help with governing for transformation by bringing all of these different elements together, the co-production of knowledge. Again, it's not necessarily new, but you need to put all of these pieces together, how you understand the concepts, how you bring the different perspectives into the management and governance processes, and how you put all of that in a context of a dynamic environment, how you bring in the resilience. So I hope this helps to understand a little bit why we have this focus on the transformation. So Fikret, please, for you to complement and add.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I think that's pretty comprehensive, so I don't have anything to add. Let's see what other people might have as questions and comments.
Thanks. So there is one question from Martha Martinez Fabiani, and they're asking, within these frameworks, how can we counterbalance the influence of the global market forces interests on the access and local resources management and its effects on small-scale fisheries?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, one of the reasons we focused on globalization in chapter 3 is that global changes are impacting small-scale fisheries in a way that never happened before. So, and I don't just mean climate change, and I don't mean just some of the things that are happening in terms of leaders of various countries, but there's a whole bunch of different kinds of impacts of global markets and globalization that are coming in. Some of it is positive. For example, FAO has definitely had a positive impact in terms of focusing on small-scale fisheries. You remember, maybe only about 10, 15 years ago, the consensus was all small-scale fisheries were going to convert into large-scale fisheries, economically rational, et cetera, and then it took a number of studies, as well as the small-scale fishery guidelines, to show that small-scale fisheries are uniquely important and they cannot be replaced, and still serve the functions of poverty reduction. Well, you can't really eradicate poverty, but poverty reduction and food security. So some of the globalization responses are positive, but there are many that are negative, and what to do about them. I mean, obviously the book has no solutions for that, but reducing vulnerability and building viability through resilience and other ways, development is going to be the way we have to try.
Maybe just to complement a bit, I think also what we're trying to do in the book is also to give a lot of examples that illustrate that small-scale fisheries are not a problem, which is still also often a perception, no? That is, it is no longer necessarily this full-scale need to transform into large-scale fisheries, but still in many countries it's considered more of a burden. So by illustrating for example, the stewardship function in some of the cases, it is also a reminder that really the necessary fact that small-scale fisheries are part of the solution and that they can really make a contribution, especially as there's an increasing awareness around the world in terms of, for example, the biodiversity losses, no? The impacts of climate change. So this re-evaluation of traditional knowledge and what different perspectives can bring to the table is hopefully something that can come out. And then obviously one of my pet issues is that also we have that chapter that brings in the human rights-based approach, which is often lacking teeth, no? Because we have, for example, examples of small-scale fisheries movements that have established what they call tribunals, where they look at human rights violations to really document them and bring them out. It often goes back then to the lack of power, no? The power imbalances that you have, that then even if you document these cases and bring them out, they're not necessarily acted upon. But hopefully this book can help to get a bigger group of, for example, students to be aware of all of these challenges and just build it into the way they think about fisheries management and governance in the future, and hopefully then are able to act and work towards a transformation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so we have a long list of questions now, so just to make it clear so that, you can, respond to as many as you could, The second question here is from Eranga Galapathy. Eranga is asking, of course, big congratulations to you both. And what are the major conceptual shifts in small-scale fisheries governance over the past decade? And what advice would you give to early career scientists to engage in community-based research in small-scale fisheries on fostering community resilience in this highly dynamic socio-political climate? And with your permission, I would combine another question, which is similar from Nabya Nair, who is also asking, how can early career researchers transitioning from technical fields like engineering into social science spaces contribute effectively to policy and governance discussions on fisheries?
Shall I try?
Go for it.
Please.
I mean, these are really important issues, really important questions. But keep in mind that many of us among the co-authors of this book started in scientific and technical fields and moved into more transdisciplinary and social fields, because that's where the action is. That's where we need more attention. And my background is as a marine ecologist. So for younger researchers moving into this area, I think it's really important that you do know the science and technology of the issues, but now go to the communities, listen to the fisheries, knowing their needs, their views, their perceptions, their knowledge is the way to engage with many of the issues that we talk about in this book, like transdisciplinary approach. Fishers don't think in terms of the scientific disciplines of biology, economics, social development, etc. They think about how do I make a living? What do I have to do to make a living? And remember, in many of these small-scale fisheries, the resources are overfished. So we do need communities and their capabilities to make the fishery sustainable and therefore make their communities sustainable. That's, by the way, a quote from Sven Jentoft, to whom we owe a lot, that sustainable fisheries need healthy communities, and healthy communities need healthy stocks. So this is, in fact, Pradeep and I wrote a paper addressing that point as well. So yeah, it's complicated. Think systems, think transdisciplinary, listen to people.
Nicole, any response to that?
Yeah, no, just briefly on how also students from different disciplines, for example, engineering, can come in. I think this is really positive, and there can be a lot that can be brought to the table. And I think one of the important aspects or approaches is really to listen and try to to understand different perspectives. But then, for example, the knowledge of an engineer that can be put at the service of what really the needs of the communities are, that can really, really help, because often it is the other way around. And technology can make a difference, for example. So also coming in and leveraging the overall progress that we see in society, for example, in terms of the advancement of technology, information communication technology, put that at the service to empower those communities, can really, really enrich and advance the livelihoods.
I mean, in the changed times, what we are seeing as a need is more engaged scholarship rather than more intellectual, in the lab kind of, scholarship. So engaged scholarship can take people to the context that you both are talking about, and therefore learn, and of course, help find new things and novel ways of, dealing with these problems, So there is a lot of messages congratulating you both, for example, from Christiana, Huemin, and all. So I'm not going to read all of that. Here is a question from Ron Johns, and Ron is asking, what are the practical links between the implementing BGSSF and these new discourses on blue transformation, especially in more authoritarian top-down governing systems?
I can try to answer that a little bit. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think this is one of the big questions, and it relates a bit to the science policy interface, no? And how do we make sure that all of the things that probably where a lot of like-minded people here agree on, like how do we make sure that then lands on the ground? And I mean, who has posed the question knows best how frustrating policy processes can be on the ground, and how changes, for example, in government can basically cancel progress that has been made in terms of embracing some of these frameworks and trying to evolve in a different direction in a country. So what we're doing, or what I need to put my FAO hat to the side now, because I'm now at Stanford for this year, but from the experience from FAO, what we have been trying to do is that we work still with the countries, and we take them through a process that we do through what we call national plans of action for small-scale fisheries, where countries that are willing to take these guidelines, which are pretty complex and demanding because they go far beyond what fisheries administrations usually deal with, and we support them in a process that brings together government representatives, ideally from different authorities, but then also fisher organizations, maybe academia, maybe NGOs. And in a number of countries, we have done that, or are in the process of doing that, to set up these kind of national task teams that look at the small-scale fisheries guidelines and prioritize them in their own national context. And in a way that is, by going through these guidelines, it is applying an interdisciplinary lens, because it looks at all these different issues that are addressed in the guidelines. And then develop a national plan of action and to then implement it. Of course, we see that some of these countries that are doing these plans or have done these plans and take some policy actions that are in a way contradictory to the principles of the guidelines. So it is a very slow process. But on the other hand, if you see, it took a long time to get the guidelines. It took a long time to get small-scale fisheries into certain processes in general. So I think we need to be patient and not give up. I think it's really important to continue to share the knowledge, to engage in particular the next generation of students, but also of policymakers. So having students that are aware of the need for co-production of knowledge, that needs to look at the fishing communities, but it also needs to extend to these different other stakeholder groups, also the decision makers in government. So having a new generation of people that takes an approach that breaks out of the silos and aims to bring all of these different groups together. I hope that we can help laying the foundations for that. And it may not be us to see it, but hopefully we will see that it is going in a direction that helps small-scale fisheries.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I'll add to that. Yeah, patience certainly Number of things are moving in the right directions, like more participatory management, more ecosystems kind of thinking, more transdisciplinarity. But really important to remember that it's the national governments that make and implement rules for fisheries as well as for most other things. FAO only has an advisory role. So the small-scale fishery guidelines are just that, guidelines. So if you want effective action, that will have to be at the national level, primarily.
Mhm. Yeah. So I have two questions which relates to connections with the biodiversity discourses that are going on. So one
Speak
is
up,
from
please, Prateep.
so there are two questions with regard to connections with the biodiversity discourses that are going on. The first one is from Moiniba Isaac. Moiniba is asking, to what extent have you considered the global biodiversity framework of 30 into 30 by 2030, and will this impact small-scale fisheries? And a related question from KM Sahariar Nazrul Rimon. And the question is, could you please reflect on your thoughts regarding the GBF's push for 30% by 2030 and how it might compromise the quality of fisheries management? Should we also place greater emphasis on fisheries management targets? So both questions are related to the 2030 target.
Sorry, I didn't understand the questions.
Nicole?
Yeah, I think these questions relate, as I understand them, to the new biodiversity framework from the CBD, the Convention for Biodiversity, and which has many objectives, the new global framework for biodiversity, but it's often reduced to the 30 by 30, which is a call to protect 30% of the land and the waters by 2030. And obviously, this has a massive impact on small-scale fisheries, and it is addressed in the book. There are examples in the sense, as I said before, that show, for example, that small-scale fisheries can play a role in that, because what we observe often, and those who ask the question know that better than me, that there's an antagonism between those that are promoting the 30 by 30 agenda, which is often supported a lot by environmental NGOs, that are quite vocal, that often have very good relations with governments and can be influential, that work mostly with the ministries of the environment in countries who declare such protected areas often. And then there is this disconnect with what is happening in the fisheries part. So in a way, the book, again, by highlighting the stewardship functions of the fishers, is trying to contribute, to illustrate that they are resource stewards. They are not what is often happening. They're not the enemy of biodiversity. Obviously, it's not all black and white. It's not that small-scale fishing by definition is sustainable. Far from saying that. But it is something that is not excluding each other. You don't need to exclude small-scale fishers in order to achieve biodiversity. So bringing those objectives together, hopefully we can help to contribute to that, those developments. And I see Fikret wants to add something.
Yeah, okay, so we're talking about 30-30.
Yeah.
That's the main emphasis, right? So that's setting aside not just 30% of terrestrial, but also 30% of aquatic area for protection in the next 30 years, or by 2030, I guess, not 30 years. The important point here is that it can't be done by banning all fishing or all uses. It has to be done by, well, sustainable use. So we're talking about IUCN protected area categories of 5 and 6, which allow for sustainable use. Now, the important thing here is that marine protected areas right now are mostly paper parks. So if we made even more of them, there'll be more paper parks, but it creates an opportunity for small-scale fisheries to work with protected area management and do a better job of sustainable use of resources. So I see this as actually as an opportunity for small-scale fisheries to work with conservation, because it serves both purposes. Better conservation gives also better livelihoods. If that's not done, then you end up just more paper parks, more policing, more I don't know what, but it won't work in the long run. So small-scale fisheries are really crucially important if we're going to go ahead with the 30-30 agenda.
Yeah, yeah. And they need to kind of, follow some of the, suggestions in your book, the approach of social ecological systems, which is a nice guideline to say, how do you combine effectively the human dimensions and the ecosystem dimensions into this, targets. I think, we're inching towards the last few minutes, but, there are a few questions that I will read it out. Amit Lahari, who is asking an interesting question, and I know Fikriti will like this. Amartya Sen prefers to approach sustainable development more as developing the freedoms to pursue choices which requires capability, the capability approach. How important is this approach to resilience building, adaptive governance, and so on?
So we're talking development capability rather than resilience capability.
Mhm.
Yes. Well, if we're talking about Amartya Sen's, is that the way the question is going?
Yes,
At least
how the
that's
capability
the way my
approach.
answer would be going. Human rights, again, simply producing more fish doesn't translate into more food. And many of the large-scale fisheries, most of the catch of the large-scale fisheries goes into reduction, fish reduction to feed animals, to turn into chickens and cattle and so on. So the small-scale fisheries are really important because they feed people directly. That's some of the points that come out of the work in Africa, for example, that small-scale fisheries in South Africa, in the African Great Lakes, go into direct human food as opposed to fish reduction. So attending people's needs rather than economic income. The motives for the fishery should not be simply to make money. It has to be oriented at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, that's what we all agreed on. And there's a conflict between the SDGs and the push with the ocean economy, the blue economy, basically to develop more industries and make more money. That's a big contradiction, and that's going to be a big problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Nicole, any response to that?
Yeah, just briefly with the capabilities and how they are important for resilience and adaptive governance. And I think, yes, they are fundamental, no? And it is something that is really at the heart, that it's not only a creating, for example, even the rules of empowerment. And also when we speak about co-management, how do we then make sure that really the capabilities around putting a co-management system in place are really granted and can be realized. So in a way, I feel that we have that capability approach. Also, you will find it in the chapters that look at the livelihoods dimension, for example. So hopefully we can show that this approach remains extremely relevant in terms also of resilience building and adaptive governance, and does not be ignored.
Yeah, yeah. And theoretically also, I believe capability in itself is a key component of, both adaptive, governance and, resilience in itself, So as you explained in the different chapters, I'll take the last question before we end, which is from Nilusika, who is asking, what is the role of Fisher's willingness to involve in these governance initiatives and the transformation processes, of course?
Sorry, what's the role of Fisher's what?
Fisher's willingness to participate in the governance, and.
Well, very important. But of course, fishers don't make decisions individually. We should be talking about communities. We should be talking about collective action as communities willing to do things together and then being able to agree among themselves. So that is a collective action problem. It's a commons problem, and that's the key.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nicole?
Yeah, and I think maybe just to add one in the chapter on co-management, one of the points for success that is pointed out relates to trust, for example. So there needs to be a trust by the different groups involved in the governance process in order to really engage. And I think fishers and the communities need to have that trust, no, in the system, in the approach, and in the different partners involved to engage in the governance processes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we are at time. Thank you very much, both Nicole and Fikret, not only for creating this book in collaboration with many people, but also using the webinar platform to talk about. It's like a double reward for many of us, because we get a copy of the book, but also we listen to the words of the makers of the book itself. So I think that was wonderful. There are two things that I kind of realized when I was going through the book itself. One is, really, the book is talking about many concepts that many people have worked for years and years, all of these chapters and all of these terms. What it tells us that, there is a need for reinforcing the importance of these concepts even years and decades after. And it is also an opportunity to kind of, reevaluating the relevance of these concepts in the changed context. So we have new drivers that have come in and all, but we are talking about in this book how the concepts that have been there for decades are still relevant in the changed context. And the book really does a wonderful job of reinforcing that idea that these are not concepts that are fit in a good fit and at one given point in time, but they can continuously provide the support to engage in the upcoming and emerging challenges within the small scale fisheries itself. So resilience, empowerment, justice, governance, all of these terms, transformation, co-management, these are all terms are still so relevant in the new context or the changed context of small scale fisheries, and it helps us to reinforce that. So thank you very much once again. I know this debates continues, and we'll have another platform to talk about this. We have already kind of circulated this to our large network, and I think we'll see that this book is taken up really nicely in the work on small scale fisheries policy, theory, and practice. And there are many more lessons to learn from the book and also your work in future. So thank you very much once again, and I bring this to an end today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the audience. Sorry, we couldn't see all of you, but remember, the authors of the book does include Prateep and Derek Armitage, who's somewhere also here, but didn't get a chance to say very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you for the big audience. We need a new generation of resource managers, of scholar practitioners, as Prateep sometimes uses the term. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you also from my side, and please contact us if you have more questions, suggestions. We hope that this can stimulate more discussion, comments, and thoughts. Thank you very much for